I'm Pat Tully of the Ketchikan Public Library, and this is Reading Aloud. This evening I'm going to read the first few chapters of a memoir by Ralph Keeler. Keeler was born in 1840 in Ohio. He was orphaned at the age of 8 and spent the next several years being shuffled between neglectful and abusive relatives. He left home for good in 1851 at the age of 11 and eventually became an entertainer and minstrel and then a travel writer. Keeler became involved in political activities in Cuba, of all places, and these activities resulted in his murder there in 1873 at the age of 33. So Keeler's memoirs are called Vagabond Adventures, and I'm going to start with Chapter 2, Family Matters. It may be laid down as a general principle to start with that a boy had better not run away from home. Good and pious reasons are not wanting, and might here be adduced, in substantiation of this general principle. Some trite moralizing might be done just now, and a grave statement that an urchin needs not run away into the world after its troubles, since they will come running to him soon enough. And that a home that is the last fortress weary men build, and oftentimes place in their wives' names, against the slings and arrows of outrageous misfortune. Why, therefore, it may be asked, with overwhelming conviction to the adult, who, by the way, is not supposed to be one of the congregation of the present preaching, why, therefore, should the juvenile fugitive hasten unduly to leave what all the effort of his afterlife will be to regain? Thus, having done my duty by any boy of a restless disposition who may chance to read these memoirs and be influenced by my vagrant example, I proceed to state that I ran away from home at the mature age of 11, and have not been back to stay overnight from that remote period to this present writing. It is due, however, to both of us, the home and myself, to observe that it was not a very attractive hearth that I ran from. My father and mother were dead, and no brothers or sisters of mine were there. Nothing at all, indeed, like affection, but sometimes very much like its opposite. On the whole, I think, under exactly the same circumstances, I would run away again. But I hope this remark will not lead the thoughtless reader to assume that I am not of a respectable family. No well-regulated memoir could be written without one. A respectable family has long since become the acknowledged starting point, and not infrequently the scapegoat of your conventional autobiography. A posteriori, therefore, our respectability is established from the very fact that there is an autobiographer in the family. When, however, a great truth has once been discovered, it is always easy to find many paths of proof converging toward it. When Kepler, for instance, by some strange guess or inspiration, hit upon the colossal fact that the planets move in elliptical orbits, it was comparatively an easy thing, or should have been, to make this scientific parallel correct, to come at half a dozen proofs of it in the simple properties of the conic sections. Thus, too, fortunately for us, the respectability of our family can be proved in many ways, and even, like Kepler's laws, by mathematics itself. Nay, our proofs can be, and indeed are, established by common arithmetical notation and numeration, because the members of our family are generally rich. This is manifestly an unusual advantage for an autobiographer, since, as is well known, he almost invariably comes of poor but honest parents. And there is no little pride mixed with the candor with which I boast that I am to this day, pecuniarily, the poorest of my race. The devious course of my wanderings as a youth and as a European tourist of 181 paper dollars left me in the early part of my life no time or inclination to look into such commonplaces as the matters of my inheritance. It was but a week ago that I rode over the broad Ohio prairie where I was born, and pass by the pleasant farms which, with the broad prairie, were the patrimony left to me, or, I should say, to the kind gentleman who administered them for me. That property has never been any care to me. It was so thoroughly administered during my minority that I have never since had the trouble even of collecting rents. Now there may be people of a recklessly imaginative type who suppose it would excite a pleasurable thrill to ride thus over a great prairie which bears one's own name, but no more tangible emolument for the quondam heir. And there may be people of so aspiring mental constitutions as to think it a grateful, rollicking piece of vanity to pass unrecognized through a town which was once sold by one's own administrator for $52. But I am free to confess that I have endured these honors within the past week, and have carried nothing away with me in the matter of gratification or sentiment, but a dash of the sadness which is settled about the wreck and ruin of the old homestead. Nothing seems to thrive there but the cold spring at the foot of the sand ridge, and the poplar and weeping willow which grow above it. These trees had and have for me a plaintive undertone to the rhythm of their rustling leaves, which I do not hope to make others hear. The willow was the whip with which a friend rode 20 miles from the county seat to visit my father in the early times, and it was stuck in the ground there, on the margin of that spring, by my little sister. The poplar was planted beside it by my mother. They are both tall trees now, and a sprig from one of them has been growing a long time over the graves of father, mother, and sister. At an early stage of my existence and of my orphanage, I was introduced to a species of in transitu life, being passed from one natural guardian to another, very much as wood is loaded upon Mississippi steamboats. It was indeed rather a rough passage of short stages, each, however, more remote from my Ohio birthplace. And I have always thought there would not have been so many figurative slivers left behind in the hands through which I passed, if the passage had not been so rough and headlong. Finally, at the age of 8 or 9 years, I was shipped away to Buffalo, New York, to be placed at school. I was sent thither down Lake Erie from Toledo on board the old steamer Indiana, Captain Appleby commanding. Many are yet living, I suppose, who will remember this craft, the first of the kind upon which I ever embarked. For my part, at least, I think I shall forget everything else before I forget the noble sheet-iron Indian who stood astride her solitary smokestack, and bent his bow and pointed his arrow at the lake breezes. A meager brass band, too, as was the generous custom of those days, was attached to the steamer, and discoursed thin, gratuitous music during the voyage. To a more sophisticated gaze, the attenuated, besmoked brave of my juvenile rapture would, alas, have looked more like an indifferent silhouette plastered belligerently against the sky, but it was the first piece of statuary I ever saw, as that execrable brass band made the first concert I ever heard, and the Apollo Belvedere at Rome, or Strauss's own orchestra, led by himself at Vienna, has never since excited in me such honest thrills of admiration. It was many and many a month before that sheet-iron Indian ceased occasionally to sail at night through a mingled cloud of coal smoke and brass music in my boyish dreams. The lake was remarkably calm, and the entire passage to Buffalo was for years one of my pleasantest memories. On that first voyage, undoubtedly, was engendered the early love of steamboats, the fruit of which ripened soon afterwards into the adventures I am about to relate. Nothing, I am convinced, but this boundless affection for the species of craft in question enables me to remember, as shall be seen directly, the names of all the old lake steamers I had to do with in my boyhood. And this, by the way, is no small internal evidence of the truth of what follows. But I should not have called your attention to the fact, and I should not have been forced to parade my conscientiousness here again, if I had not come already to the most embarrassing period in all my history. Without seeming to manifest a feeling which I am sure I do not now entertain, I cannot write about the 2 or 3 miserable years I passed in Buffalo, and if I omit to write about them, a great share of the dramatic flavor of my story is lost. I cannot, therefore, convey to you even the regret with which I am compelled to pass over this period in my life, because you cannot know, as I think I do, that exactly such a childish experience of unlovely restraint has never yet got into literature. Every time I pass the old public schoolhouse number 7 in Buffalo, I stop and gaze at it with a queer sort of interest. Yet I cannot confess to any sentimental regard for it, since it was, after a manner, the innocent cause of my enduring, at least, the last 6 months of my unpleasant life in its neighborhood. If I had not been so interested by day in the principle and duties of that school, I am sure I should have fled much sooner than I did from the roof which sheltered me of nights. Finally, however, one domestic misunderstanding, greater than many others, brought me to a conclusion which was certainly as comprehensive in its wrath as it may have been lacking in a premise or two of its logic. At this temperate remove from that exciting period, I am led, at least, to doubt, in the interest of certain kin of mine, who could hardly have been responsible for the facts they knew not of, whether I was not guilty of that poetic fallacy, placed in its first utterance, I believe, in the mouth of an illustrious Trojan, and worn very threadbare ever since in the mouth and practice of almost every one, whether I did not, that is, learn a great deal too much from one to judge very unjustly of all. At any rate, in the domestic crisis just alluded to, I rebelled against authority, whose insignia were fasces of disagreeable beech whips, and at the mature age of 11 years took a solemn vow that I would have nothing more to do with the people of my home circle in Buffalo, or with any whatsoever of my relatives, some of whom had placed me there, and I ran away. Chapter 3. A Fugitive. Escaping from the house at night, I did not have time or presence of mind to take anything with me but what I carried on my back. One of my schoolfellows, who had been forewarned of my design, met me by appointment on the neighboring corner, and smuggled me into his father's stable. Here it had been agreed I was to lodge on the hay. My friend was a doughty, reassuring sort of fellow, who was a great comfort to me at that nervous moment when I entered the darkness of the hay-mow. I would not for the world have betrayed any fraction of the fear which his swaggering manner may have failed to dispel. He would assuredly have laughed at me, and I believe now, moreover, he would have taken that, or any shadow of an excuse, for joining me in my flight. So strong indeed was the romantic instinct upon that young gentleman that he lingered long about the spot where I had crawled into the hay and covered up my head, before he could prevail upon himself to go back into the house and to his regular bed. He had assured me before we came into the stable, out of the pleasant moonlight of that late spring evening, that he envied me very much, as I was going to have lots of fun. He only wished that he had a good reason to run away from home, too. But then he added thoughtfully, as he looked up at the lights in the window of the family sitting room, that his mother was so derned kind, and his father was so blamed good, that he didn't see how he could leave them just now. The next morning, my friend found me sleeping very comfortably, with my head and one arm protruding limply out of the hay. Awakening me, he proceeded to draw from his trouser pockets several pieces of bread and butter for my breakfast, which was none the less toothsome from its somewhat disheveled state, consequent upon the manner of its previous stowage. While munching that surreptitious meal, my thoughts very naturally wandered to the breakfast table, where I should that morning probably be missed for the first time by the people from whom I had fled, and I amused myself, as well as my romantic caterer, with what we both of us, no doubt, considered a highly humorous account of the grievous commotion which would ensue at that ordinarily so solemn victualling. Emboldened by the lively appreciation of my schoolfellow, and by the reviving influence of the bread and butter, I grew imaginative and grotesque in my daring pleasantry. I went so far as to describe the scene at that breakfast table when Bridget came to the dining room with wild eyes and the announcement that my room had not been occupied the night before, how the paterfamilias at that dramatic moment had dropped a surprise spoon into the splattering gravy of the stewed meat, and how his wife opposite, then in the act of pouring chicory, had, whether in dismay at the overwhelming news or at the sudden soiling of her tablecloth, upset the coffee pot. These and many more brilliant and mirth-provoking feats of boyish humor, very brilliant and mirth-provoking, of course, I mean to my friend and myself, did I perform that morning in the haymow, all bearing upon the assumed utter discomfiture of the bereaved people about that breakfast table. But, alas, even a precocious autobiographer, with his mouth full of bread and butter, may make the mistake, so common to the adult of his species, of overestimating his own importance. I have since learned that there was no sensation of any consequence at the breakfast table in question, and that my subsequent permanent loss was taken with remarkable equanimity and resignation. It was expressive, nay, eloquent, look of envy and admiration that my friend gave me when it came time for him to leave me to my own devices for the forenoon, while he went reluctantly to school. Even to this moment I cannot say that I covet the amount of knowledge he carried away from his books that day, or indeed the succeeding 3 days. I sallied stealthily forth to amuse myself in the by-streets, till he came back at noon to bring me my dinner, which consisted of the repetition of the breakfast with the added dessert of an apple. This latter he carried carefully in his hand, but the bread and butter he invariably bore stowed away in his trouser pocket. I say invariably, for I lived 2 or 3 days thus on his secret bounty. About dusk of the second evening he came to me with, in addition to the bread and butter for my supper, the startling news that he was going to take me to the theater. I do not remember how we got in. It was not, certainly, by paying our way. I incline to the opinion that my friend had some secret understanding with the door tender. I know merely that, by some means, we achieved our entrance to the pit of the old Eagle Street Theater. I have heard good citizens of Buffalo complain that, since Lola Montez burned down that seat of the histrionic muse, the drama has languished in their city. Of course I am not competent to decide in such matters, but, that being the first playhouse of any kind I ever entered, I am glad to be able to say that I have never since seen anything in the theatrical line so absorbingly thrilling, or so gorgeously magnificent, as the old Eagle Street Theater was to me that night. The name and the plot of the play I have forgotten, but the dark frown of that smooth villain in the third act, where his villainy first began to show itself to my unpracticed comprehension, will never fade from my remembrance. I do not know how it was, but up to that time I recollect I was under the juvenile impression that virtue and correct grammar always went together. I can therefore convey no idea of the shock with which I learned so late in the play that the splendidly dressed man who could talk such eloquent, persuasive language, and withal in such scrupulous conformity to that most difficult of rules which keeps the verb under the regimental discipline of its subject, nominative, that the man whose plaintive periods sometimes rose to the iambic majesty of blank verse, and who never got a case or a tense wrong, howsoever wild, ecstatic, or dithyrambic his utterances of devotion to that innocent, long-suffering angel, the walking lady, that this man, I say, should nevertheless turn out to be a monster, whom, to borrow a little from his style of phraseology, it were mild flattery to call the greatest and vilest of rogues. My memory of the whole evening is swallowed up in the overwhelming shock of that sad surprise. The grammatical Arcadia of my boyish belief was laid waste as with an earthquake. The next morning, after I had eaten my usual bread and butter with more than usual appetite, I received a few choice friends at my lodgings in the haymow, and we had a consultation. It was suggested that I was too near my former haunts to be safe. Indeed, rumors of an actual search for me had reached the ears of one boy, of whom, oddly enough, I can recall nothing more now than that those ears of his were remarkably large ones, and stood out prominently from each side of his head. That the best and most picturesque view of those ears was, in my opinion, to be had from my desk just behind him at school, and that I was especially attracted and edified by my observations upon them immediately after he had his hair clipped short. Those are grotesque pranks, by the way, which the memory sometimes plays us when we attempt to grope back too far. Another one of those daring spirits, for instance, who was loudest, and therefore, I fear, most influential, with his counsels that morning in the haymow, has faded as to body, name, and station wholly from my mind, and exists to me now literally as a cherub with a mammoth straw hat for wings. From anything that I can positively remember, I would not be prepared to take my oath that he ever had any arms, legs, or trunk at all. I can recall only his big, round, staring eyes, which stood out at the tops of his puffy cheeks like a couple of glass knobs, and his red hair, whose decisive, precipitous ending all around his head left a queer impression that rats, or some larger and more ferocious animal, had been his barber. I forget now whether it was in sport or in earnest that I used to say of myself, that boy's hair had been trod off. It must have been his facial aspect, heightened, of course, by his winged straw hat, aided him materially in the expression of his fears with regard to my safety. For this cherubic Agamemnon carried every point in that council of war, and it was unanimously resolved that I should change my quarters. Accordingly, the next night, I was entertained in the stable of another of my schoolfellows, residing at the remotest corner of the district. Now, I do not want to be considered fastidious or luxurious in my tastes, but I must own to a very loud complaint, entered the morning afterwards, against the comparative discomforts of this new lodging. There was very little hay in the stable to which I had been transferred, and the boards, moreover, were very hard indeed. It may have been an improper spirit in which I made the remark, but I went back again to the first schoolfellow who has figured in this narrative, and told him if a boy hadn't a respectable barn to invite a friend to, he needn't think I was going to be his guest. That's all. After watching for a moment the impression of my words upon my friend, I said furthermore that I was going to strike out for myself, as I was growing tired of the monotony of haymows and bread and butters. Anyways, I wanted a change. Then came one of the most impressive moments that I shall have to chronicle in these memoirs. For, as soon as I had finished speaking, my friend slapped me vigorously on the back, making this at the same time, with an excited shrillness, this observation, "Hey!" which, being a common juvenile exclamation, had, of course, no jocose allusion to the principal subject of my discourse. "Hey! Bully for you!" continued my enthusiastic friend and schoolfellow, as soon as he could get his breath, which the suddenness of his lucky thought had evidently taken away. "Hey, that's just what I do. I go out in the world and seek my fortune, like the boys in the storybooks. And," said he, suddenly changing his tone and manner to those of the most excessive gravity and deliberation, "and that you needn't be without means to help you along, take these." Whereupon he drew forth from his capacious trousers pocket and placed in my hand 5 large copper cents, which at first had the appearance of so many oysters fried in batter, so girt about and covered were they with fragments of bread and butter, deposited, I suppose, in the course of my friend's entire catering. It was indeed, as he assured me, his whole cash capital, but he would not hear to my scruples at taking it. More earnest or impressive about it, or, under the circumstances, more self-denying and truly generous he could not have been if he had been giving the world away. So that morning we parted, he wending his way, by no means con amore, to school, and I with a queer, uncertain feeling in the region of my small waistcoat, going forth, my 5 coppers in my pocket, to seek my fortune. Chapter 4. A Stormy Time. Deserting entirely the haunts of my playfellows, I stole down the wharves. Here the sight of the crowded shipping brought back, more strongly than ever, the memory of that exhilarating trip on the old Indiana, with her sublime brass band and warlike sheet-iron Indian, and I tried to hire out on a steamboat. The people to whom I made application eyed me suspiciously, for I was very small of my age. They also asked me a great many disagreeable questions, and generally ended by advising me to go home to my friends, if I had any. My size was manifestly against me. Vainly I assured them that I was 11 years old and my own master. They shook their heads and told me brusquely to go ashore. At last I went on the board of a steamer called the Diamond, and after a little inquiry found the steward, a man with a face like the old steamer itself, with just seams enough in it, from long battling the old lake breezes, to give hints of sturdy timbers, or, I should say, of hidden strength. His determined mouth ran across his face like one of those bolted arches across the hurricane deck. Large, strong, firm. His hair may be thin and gray now, and his back bent with the years, if they have not beached him as they have the old steamer, and carried him away altogether. But so great was the impression this man made on me then, that I think I should still recognize him whenever or wherever we might chance to meet. Having, I remember, gone through the usual colloquy with him as a steward, I assured him as a man that I did not know where to go if I did go ashore, that I had no home and no friends, and, in a word, so played upon his good nature that he told me to go into the pantry and go to work. I obeyed. That is, I went into the pantry and went to work, upon the heartiest meal that I had ever partaken of up to that date. The steward meant that I should help a greasy-looking fellow, whom I found washing dishes there when I entered. Overcome, however, by the savory smell of meats and other remains of dinner, which had not yet gone down into the kitchen, the first words I said to the succulent pantryman were framed into a demand for something to eat. As soon as he recovered his equanimity and his dishcloth, which the latter he had dropped in sheer surprise at what he evidently considered my stupendous impudence, the pantryman wanted to know, bluntly, what I was doing there, and while he gave his foot such a preliminary flourish as plainly indicated his intention to accelerate my motion thence, I informed him in considerable haste that I came by the steward's order. This straightway altered the case in the opinion of the obsequious menial. He now pointed at a row of chafing dishes and said, "There it is, pitch in." A few moments afterward, the steward found me so absorbed in my work that I did not notice his entrance into the pantry. Bread and butter in small quantities, and at irregular intervals, had been, it must own, rather poor satisfaction to the appetite of a growing boy. The steward must have watched me some time in silence, for my eyes, happening to float away at random in an ecstasy of pleased and vigorous mastication, encountered him, standing not far from my side, gazing at me earnestly. I dropped my knife and fork in fear, as he had talked to me like a rough, surly fellow. His voice was wholly changed now when he spoke, and I noticed it. "Why," he asked, "didn't you tell me you was hungry?" My only answer was to let my eyes fall from his face to the roast beef and potatoes yet undevoured before me. "There, eat as much as you want," said the steward, in a softer voice still. "Come to think," he added, "you needn't wash dishes. I'll use you in the cabin." For some reason, I had gained a friend in that gruff fellow. 3 days later, he knocked the same greasy pantryman down for abusing me. Indeed, he fought for me many times afterwards, as I would gladly fight for him now if I knew where to find him, and if I was sure of the success which always attended him as my champion. So I will stop now. Have a wonderful week, and thank you for joining me.